Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bed crimers. As always, I wish you the best. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching this video, if you learned something or enjoyed it, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Now, let's dig in. Many people are wondering if defendant Bryan Kohberger, who is accused of harming 4 University of Idaho students, will be offered a plea deal. Some people on Reddit are saying that they are pretty sure he will get a plea deal and that he will likely take it because if found guilty, he could be sentenced to death. In my opinion, I do not believe that Kohberger would take a plea deal even if offered one. He's the type who's never going to admit what he allegedly did. However, I also don't believe he will be given a plea deal. I say this because I've heard many experts, including former federal prosecutor Naima Rahmani, say that the state won't offer Kohberger a plea deal. First, they have nothing to give him. Rahmani said the case is going to trial in all likelihood and that there is more than enough evidence to convict the defendant. Rahmani also mentioned the Lori Vallow Daybell case and said that Idaho botched that one because Vallow should have been facing the death penalty. After all, she did in her 2 children and doesn't seem to show any remorse for it. Rahmani called Vallow a complete sociopath. Although Rahmani is confident the state has enough evidence to convict Bryan Kohberger, he did say they will have to find a way to explain the lack of blood evidence in his car and apartment. Apparently, there are other cases where, despite a gruesome crime in which you'd expect to see a lot of blood, there wasn't a lot, and the prosecution was able to successfully explain why not. Case in point, the Phil Spector trial. Prosecutors accused the famous music producer, Phil Spector, he's the guy who had the crazy hairdo, very Hollywood, of doing in a VIP hostess from the House of Blues, Lana Clarkson. Clarkson, beautiful blonde actress, was found dead at Spector's Alhambra mansion on February 3rd of 2003, slumped in a chair with her legs outstretched in front of her. Clarkson had been shot in the mouth. Spector claimed she did this to herself because she was despondent about her fading hopes of becoming a Hollywood star. The prosecution said Spector was drunk and became angry when Clarkson refused his advances. Apparently, Spector was wearing a white woman's jacket. Very Hollywood. But it only had about 18 tiny drops of Clarkson's blood on it. The defense argued the jacket would have been covered in the red stuff if Spector had been close enough to put the barrel in her mouth. Spector's attorneys argued that the absence of blood on the jacket cuffs in particular was evidence that Spector was not the shooter. It became a battle between the state's experts versus the defense's. Spector actually had 2 trials. The first ended in a hung jury. His subsequent retrial, when he was convicted of the crime, led to Spector spending his final years in prison and ultimately dying at the age of 81 of COVID-19. It will be fascinating to find out how the prosecutors will tackle the reported lack of blood evidence in Kohberger's car and apartment, if that's true. We know he meticulously cleaned his white Hyundai Elantra while in Pennsylvania because law enforcement officials watched him do it. Will that be the prosecution's only theory as to why there wasn't a treasure trove of DNA evidence in the car? Will they say Kohberger did the same thing at his apartment after the crime, that he cleaned it meticulously? Will they posit that he somehow had his car seat covered with something that protected it from blood? Will they say he quickly stripped off the black clothing he allegedly was wearing during the commission of the crime before he got into the Elantra, put the clothing in multiple plastic trash bags, and then dumped those bags somewhere over those remote country roads. Once again, I can't wait for this trial to hear how all of this is going to be presented. From what some YouTube experts, as well as people who know Bryan Kohberger say, I believe there's a strong possibility he's a narcissist, or at the very least has narcissistic personality traits. Some experts believe that Kohberger is likely enjoying all this attention, that he is getting a kick out of hearing people talk about the crime and about him. He may want to go to trial because that would be another opportunity to have his alleged crime discussed. And it may be that he's not terribly worried about facing the death penalty anytime soon. Kohberger has studied criminology and the criminal justice system. He is very well aware that many inmates on death row never have to face the death chamber, that through the appeals process, those on death row can stave off that ultimate punishment for decades. Don't forget about Idaho death row inmate Gerald Pizzuto Jr. He's gotten out of his execution for 37 years thus far. I listened to a recent show on hidden true crime where Dr. John Mathias and his wife Lauren discussed a theory they've come up with a possible motive for the crime that occurred at 1122 King Road and that took the lives of Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, Maddie Mogan, and Xana Kernodle. I like to say the students' names because they're the ones we need to remember. Let's not let them get lost in all these discussions. In leading up to their new idea for a motive, Dr. John and Lauren talked about the psychology that may have fueled the crime. But before I dive into it, let me just say that Bryan Kohberger has yet to be convicted, so he is presumed innocent. However, he has been charged by the Moscow police, and he is their one and only suspect. So for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to speculate that he is the perpetrator. This is just for discussion's sake. As part of their explanation for this new motive, Dr. John and Lauren went over a timeline of events in Kohberger's life that they feel may have led up to the explosion of rage on November 13, 2022. They circled back to his formative years and that series of posts made in 2011 on a forum called Tapatalk by a user many believe to have been Bryan Kohberger. Dr. John pointed out that in these posts, Kohberger spoke about his emotional and mental struggles. It would appear that he was suffering from depression and anxiety from an early age. Later, after being bullied and rejected, primarily by female classmates, the overweight Kohberger went on a diet and took up kickboxing. In the process, he managed to shed 130 pounds. All of this led to what appears to be some obsessive-compulsive behaviors. We know Kohberger is very strict with his vegan diet and that he maintained his slim physique through running. Dr. John brought up Kohberger's high school-era addiction to the Big H and posited that perhaps Kohberger tried this drug to self-medicate away his depression and anxiety. Per Dr. John, this drug can lessen anxious thoughts. Dr. John then described Kohberger as being extremely sensitive, introverted, prone to depression and anxiety, and suffering from social awkwardness. That social awkwardness seems to have followed him throughout his life like an unwanted shadow. Trying as he might, Kohberger didn't seem to be able to change that one thing about himself. Through it all, whether Zoftic or rail thin, Bryan seems to have remained a pariah when it comes to attracting the attention of pretty females that he seems to have felt entitled to hanging out with. There are stories of him going up to females and boldly saying, "Let's hang out." That's a pretty bold move. It would indicate that Kohberger presumed these pretty females should and would like him and want to spend time with him. One woman from his college years described that uncomfortable Tinder date with him. She said that after the date, Kohberger insisted on walking her to her dorm room, where he proceeded to tickle her, a move the female found weird and rather juvenile. It was as if this young man was a little kid and had no clue how to behave on a first date. After Kohberger finally left, he sent his date a text in which he told her that she had really good birthing hips. I think we can all agree that isn't going to win a guy a second date. Dr. John said he can't say for sure if Kohberger is on the autism spectrum, and if so, if that could explain some of his social awkwardness. awkwardness. Not that everyone who's on the autism spectrum is socially awkward. That's why they call it a spectrum. Once over the addiction and graduated from high school, Kohberger pursued higher education, and he became a really good student. At DeSales, Associate Professor Michelle Bolger, who taught him, described Kohberger as a, quote, great writer, and said he was, quote, a brilliant student. She also stated that in her 10 years of teaching, she'd only recommended 2 students to a PhD program, and Kohberger was one of them. For Bryan, this success in academia must have made him feel so happy and as if he'd found a place where he finally fit in. So his education and success at school must have become huge parts of his identity. And the PhD program that he was accepted into at Washington State University must have felt like another sign that this is where he belonged. His timeline at WSU becomes incredibly important. I say this because the succession of events that occurred there may just explain why he allegedly exploded in rage on November 13th. He moved to Pullman, Washington to begin his PhD program in criminology on June 25th of 2022. On this same day, his mother, Mary Ann, allegedly posted some comments under the name Downton Love on Reddit as part of a group she played a design game with. If these posts were in fact made by Mrs. Kohberger, they reveal a woman who loves her son, still worries about him even though he's a young man at that point, and who may have babied him well into young adulthood. When Marianne made that post, Bryan was actually 27 years old, an age when many young people are already out of the nest, some married with children, some in the military and posted in faraway places. Marianne comes across as being very protective of Bryan, and she expresses concern for her son as he makes a cross-country move from Pennsylvania to Washington State. Downton Love, aka Marianne Kohberger, wrote, "Hello friends. Today my 26-year-old son left for Washington State to begin his doctorate in criminology. We live in Pennsylvania. I probably won't be submitting many designs in the next few days because I will be too busy crying. I will see you all soon." Then, after someone replies to her, Marianne responds with, "Thank you so much for saying that to me. My son will be in Pullman in the eastern part of the state, quite close to the Idaho border. He knows absolutely no one, and we have no family there. I worry about him being lonely, so your message made me feel better." Note that Marianne actually misstated Bryan's age. He was 27, not 26, when he moved to Pullman. Dr. John suggested that maybe Marianne deliberately wrote that younger age because she was embarrassed that her 27-year-old son was only just then leaving the family home, and this was the first time Bryan would have been living outside that home. When he attended DeSales, he lived at home. Dr. John also speculated that perhaps Marianne wanted to view Bryan as younger than he was, that perhaps she was in denial about his actual age. I find it odd that a mother would forget her child's age, because if anyone's going to remember your age and birthday, it's typically your mom. But then again, it's possible this is no big deal, and it's just one of those moments where a harried parent makes a simple mistake. Marianne has 2 daughters as well, so she has to keep 3 birthdays straight and 3 ages straight. At a certain age, many people have trouble remembering their own ages and may get it wrong by a year. It happens. In any event, Marianne is clearly expressing her sadness and her fears for her son leaving home and traveling to a place so far away where he doesn't know anyone. She may also fear that Bryan will have trouble making friends as he had throughout middle and high school. With him so far from home, she can no longer be his daily buffer against bullies, rejection, or thoughts of unworthiness. Dr. John felt that perhaps Marianne had been both super supportive to Bryan, but also maybe overly protective of him. And it's also possible that she helped cultivate a superiority complex in her son, making him believe that because she loved and adored him, that all females would do the same. So Bryan moves, and his semester at Washington State University where he's also garnered a prestigious teaching assistant position, or TA position as they say, begins in August. He finds himself a TA for 3 undergraduate criminal justice classes, all 3 under the supervision of Professor John Schneider. And by the way, for a PhD seeker to teach 3 classes along with completing his own schoolwork, well, that's not easy. It's a lot of work if you want to do it all well. So there has to be some stress involved in all of this. I was a TA and I taught 2 classes a day, and I was so stressed out my first semester that I would go home and cry into my pillow. I wanted to get out of that TA position so badly, but I felt I couldn't because the faculty would see me as a failure. So I persevered, but it was hell at times. That's August. Kohberger is just starting out on his PhD journey. This should be his milieu. He's done well before at a university. Why should this be any different? Come September, Bryan applies for an internship with the Pullman Police Department. He writes an essay expressing his interest in helping rural cops better collect and analyze technological data in public safety operations. But despite being one of the finalists, Bryan doesn't get the internship. That had to have been a wound to his ego. Then on September 23rd, just a month into his PhD program, something really bad happens. He gets into a verbal altercation with his supervisor, Professor John Schneider. This is not good. At this point, Kohberger should be on his best behavior with the criminology faculty and doing everything in his power to be both a stellar student and a very professional TA. To get into an ugly verbal altercation with a faculty professor just 1 month into the semester is an ominous sign. The faculty professors hold the keys to Kohberger's future in the PhD program and ultimately in his career. So already Kohberger isn't getting the praise and support that he's used to in academia. He also doesn't have his mother nearby to bolster his confidence and soothe him. On October 3rd, Bryan has to meet with higher-ups in the criminology department because of that verbal altercation. So now the whole faculty is aware of the incident. Kohberger is also receiving complaints from female students about his behavior in the classroom and on campus. One female student tells the faculty that Bryan followed her to her car one day, which apparently made her very uncomfortable and creeped her out. Then on October 21st, Kohberger receives an email from the faculty, and in it explains the ways in which he's failing to meet their expectations for him as a TA. More negative feedback. Things are spiraling now into a disaster. Next, on November 2nd, the graduate director of the criminology department, Dale Willits, and another professor meet with Bryan to discuss an improvement plan. Kohberger agrees to the plan. Now think about this in terms of the timeline. November 2nd is just 11 days before the crime in Moscow, Idaho. At this point, Kohberger is confronting nothing but trouble at WSU. His career is imploding. He's getting into trouble, likely because of his personality, his lack of social awareness, and his arrogance. Keep in mind, too, that teaching assistants at WSU receive a stipend each month to pay their rent, and out-of-state tuition is waived the first year until the TA can establish residency. Kohberger likely needs that TA position to continue studying at WSU, and it would appear that he plans on completing his PhD there because he's already started the process of establishing residency by getting a Washington driver's license and by registering his car and by registering himself to vote in the state. Out-of-state PhD students at WSU are expected to establish residency. If Kohberger blows the TA job, then he can probably kiss his career at WSU goodbye. And I doubt he shared any of these problems with his parents. Say this because when he and his dad are pulled over for those 2 traffic stops on the drive home to Pennsylvania for the holidays, Michael Kohberger is clearly beaming with pride as he tells the officer that his son is in the PhD program. I doubt Mr. Kohberger would have been so genuinely proud of his son if he knew about all the troubles Bryan was having with the faculty, with his students, with his classmates. So the ultra-sensitive Bryan Kohberger is being criticized by Professor Snyder and the other professors in the department. Maybe it feels to Bryan as if he's being bullied by them and like they're all ganging up on him unfairly. According to an article I read on the website for aspirecounseling.com, people suffering from narcissism and those who are sociopaths often show patterns of being vengeful, controlling, obsessive, and intimidating. The website says, quote, "When a narcissist is violated to the core, the narcissist may act out with rage. This rage is often identified to be a response to what is known as narcissistic injury. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders describes narcissistic injury to be, quote, vulnerability in self-esteem, which makes narcissistic people very sensitive to injury from criticism or defeat. Although they may not show it outwardly, criticism may haunt these individuals and may leave them feeling humiliated, degraded, hollow, and empty. They react with disdain, rage, or a defiant counterattack," end quote. And along with the nonstop criticism Kohberger is receiving at the university, he may also have been feeling rejected from pretty females in the area. We heard Bryan reportedly slid into the direct messages of one of the 4 victims. A source told People magazine that Kohberger messaged a victim on Instagram in the weeks before the crime, but the victim never replied. Although the victim may never have seen Kohberger's DMs, he likely perceived her non-response as a rejection. Dr. John feels that it's possible that the motive for the crime may have been to even the score, not just with a pretty female who rejected him, but also with Washington State University and Professor Snyder. In this motive, Kohberger may have wanted to commit the perfect crime as a way to secretly stick it to the criminology faculty, as in, "I'm so much smarter than all of you that I pulled off a quadruple homicide and the cops have no clue who did it. You all think you're so smart, but now you're all talking about a crime that I pulled off and that you'll probably be analyzing in your classes in the future." Ha 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 ha. Maybe in the beginning, this crime planning stuff, the 11 late night trips to the King Road neighborhood, maybe all of that was just for fun, a way to live out the behavior that Kohberger learned about from his textbooks, and a way to spend the lonely weekends. Maybe Kohberger was emulating famous serialists like Dennis Rader and Ted Bundy, whom he'd studied. He knew that they stalked their victim. Maybe this was Kohberger's own internship, a way to live out the fantasy of exacting revenge on the faculty at WSU and on every pretty girl who'd ever ignored him, bullied him, not gone on a date with him. But maybe his own internship picked up speed as time went by, and the criticism mounted, and the desire for revenge grew. Post the crime, Kohberger met with the faculty, including with Professor Snyder, on December 7th to discuss his progress in terms of the improvement plan. At that point, the faculty was saying that while he'd not yet perfectly met their expectations, he had made some progress, so that was positive. Remember, Kohberger had seemed more friendly post the crime and had started giving all his students, males and females alike, good grades. He appeared to be happier, bubblier, but then on December 9th, Kohberger had a second verbal altercation with Professor Snyder. In Kohberger's termination letter, it says that the latest altercation had made it clear that he had not made any progress regarding professionalism. So Kohberger really hadn't changed his stripes. He merely suppressed them for a while. His inability to play nice with Professor Snyder was still there. And on December 19th, Kohberger was informed that he'd been terminated as a TA for the spring semester. The termination letter came after he arrived in Pennsylvania. And if he hadn't yet told his parents of the firing, they would soon learn that he was in deeper trouble than that when their front door was smashed down by FBI agents to arrest their son in the early morning hours of December 30th. What do you guys think? Is it possible that the motive was to stick it to and exact revenge on not just every female who rejected him, but also to the faculty of the criminology department at WSU who began criticizing him as early as 1 month into his PhD program? Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please smash the like button. Consider supporting my channel through a Patreon subscription. Definitely subscribe and hit that notification bell. See you next time.